right, hi everyone. So just before I introduce Pete, we're gonna go until about 12:45, 12:50, just to give people time to like get to class and that kind of thing. And then we'll start the Q&A at 1 o'clock. All right, so I'm very excited to introduce Pete. He's been doing undercover investigations for animal rights groups for 18 years. He's investigated, this is a very long list, puppy mills, pet stores, facilities that sell dogs and cats to research labs, livestock auctions, dairies, egg farms, broiler farms, hatcheries, hog farms, commercial fishing boats, and slaughterhouses of all kinds. He's worked across the US, Canada, Mexico, Brazil, and India, and he's even created an investigator training program which is used by multiple animal rights groups. His clients have included the Companion Animal Protection Society, HSUS, Animal Equality, Mercy for Animals, Compassion Over Killing, the Humane Farming Association, and the Animal Welfare Institute. So we're very excited to welcome Pete to Harvard Law School, and please join me in welcoming him and thanking him for all the amazing work he's done.
Thanks, everybody. Appreciate it. Thank you for having me here. To be honest, it's kind of a dream come true for me to be speaking here at Harvard Law. I have been to 3 community colleges and 2 universities, and I have 0 degrees, so this is a big deal for me. I'm going to speak about investigative work in the animal rights movement. I'm going to focus on the kind of things, I'm going to use examples from the kind of things that I have firsthand knowledge of, because I don't want to give out a lot of abstracts or hypotheticals. I want it to be very concrete. So if you have any, there'll be a Q&A afterwards, so if you have any specific questions about an industry that I didn't discuss, I'm happy to answer those questions if I can. Half my work has been CAFO, slaughter, commercial fishing. The other half of my career has been just dogs. Puppy mills, dogs sold to research labs, pet stores. I have a book coming out about that called Rescue Dogs in the Fall. So keep an eye out for that. So if I say undercover animal cruelty investigations, raise your hand if you have a clue what I'm talking about. Okay, we all have most of us have a basic idea. All right. Raise your hand if you're a lawyer or a law student. Okay, all right, okay, it's about half. So I'm going to try to cater this to you. Now, out of the people who are law students, how many of you are looking to work in the animal protection movement? Okay, we got a few of you. Okay, I'm going to try to cater that. How many of you work or volunteer with any kind of NGO, any kind of AR group, nonprofit? Okay, we got a bunch of you. Okay, so I'm going to try to cater this to you. Here we go. So, first of all, I'm going to tell you I have a cap and shades on because I do undercover work. I'm still active in the field. I know it sounds crazy that making a living doing undercover work, that this is all it would take for me to continue to do it. But yes, this is all it takes. So, just accept that. So, all right. First, I'll go over why the purposes of undercover investigation and why we do that. So, as I'm sure many of you know, there's a lot of animal rights groups that exist in the world, and they're all NGOs, right? They're non-government organizations. They're funded through donations. What I do is a little bit different than what law enforcement does, right? If law enforcement is going to do some kind of an investigation, like an animal cruelty investigation, most often when we think about that, we think that means that someone, like you would say, hey Pete, somebody just kicked their dog, and I saw them, and they went to that apartment. There's nothing I can do about it. I can't get a warrant, right? I can't, reasonable cause doesn't mean anything for me. I have no jurisdiction in any particular area. I'm just a civilian. I'm unlicensed, I just do what I do, right? When law enforcement does undercover work for animal cruelty, if it's at the federal level, that's often wildlife trafficking. If it's at the local level, that is more often going to be something that's going to be like animal fighting, and it's going to be usually connected to other types of crimes. That's also going to involve arms trafficking, narcotics, gambling, things like that, right? It just so happens that fighting dogs are fighting chickens as well. No, in the United States, no law enforcement agency exists to do any kind of undercover work for factory farms or slaughterhouses or puppy mills. It just doesn't exist. No one goes undercover into a lab or into a circus. It falls upon civilians, and so that's why we do what we have to do. So we try to uncover the truth about things, find crimes, and we also want to support campaigns. So as you can see, for example, for puppy mills, the top left picture, if I was to go to a puppy mill, I would look for violations of the Animal Welfare Act if they're USDA license. I'm going to explain that in detail in a bit. I typically, what I'll do is, without giving away too much of a methodology, I work for a group called the Humane Animal Protection Society. We'll go into pet stores and we'll get statements from people, and they'll say, oh, no, all these puppies you see, they all come from breeders, and all those breeders, I'm not making this up, this is what a lot of them say, all these breeders are in the Midwest, because that way there's farmland and these dogs have all that space to run, right? It's like, okay, that's obviously bullshit. So then I go out, and then I take pictures like this, and I show that they're lying, right? Depending on the state, for example, New York, that could be a violation of lemon law, right? So I could fall over, I could hit the pet store. For like, as you see in the top right, that's a dead dolphin that came out of the drift gillnet. In 2017, I was on a bunch of commercial fishing boats, including drift gillnet boats. And what I saw was that every trip I went out on these boats where they take this mile-long net and they set it out in the ocean and they go after swordfish and various sharks and sometimes tuna. Every single time there'd be dead sea mammals coming out. Dolphins and sea lions is what I saw. And it's not illegal. It's perfectly fine to catch a dead dolphin out of the come. It's illegal not to report it, right? Because the feds want to know. And once you get a certain limit or protected species coming up, they cut your fishery early, right? And that's simply how one reports it, right? So finding out the truth about that industry is showing, guys, this happens all the time and no one reports it. The crime was that they're not reporting it. And so then the campaign that was supported was that California passed a law so that now that fishery is banned, and by 2022 there will be no more drift gillnet fisheries. You see a guy here, he's waterboarding a cow. The cow came down, we couldn't stand, so they punched and kicked her in the face and decided to spray her in the face. This is at Andrews Dairy Farm in Wisconsin in 2013. The truth about the dairy industry is there's constantly animal abuse of new cows that don't know what to do and they're going to get milked, and there's constantly abuse of old down cows, right? The crimes that we look for, which I'll explain in a bit, there's predictable criminal behavior we focus on that includes abusing down cows. And the campaigns that we focus on, this case was done for an NGO called Mercy for Animals, and they used it so the Great Lakes cheese would then change some of their animal welfare policies. So we go in, that's kind of the dynamic that we go with. We have, when we do this, this is for all you law students, I'm sure this is kind of a big thing you want to know, there are certain legal concerns that we have to focus on before we even go in. I can't give you too much about our methodology, but I mean, there's different ways, depending on the target, there's different things we can do, right? We can do surveillance, we can do a walk-on. A walk-on is like, would be like, hey, that you have a puppy, I want to buy some puppies, let me just take a look around, and I'm going to go look for stuff to produce a terrible puppy mill, right? And then there's employment-based cases, which is, hey, can I please work at your puppy mill, right? And then that's where I'm going to see probably a lot more criminal activity than just if I walked on. So the most obvious concerns ag ed laws. Does anyone not know what an ag ed law is? Okay, ag ed law, it exists in a few states that didn't overturn because they're unconstitutional, but there's different kinds. Some kinds of ag ed laws specifically say you cannot misrepresent yourself to obtain employment at an animal enterprise, right? So for example, if I want to work on your hog farm, I could say, hey, I'm Pete, and I'll give you my real name, I'll give you my real date of birth and all that, but if you ask me, do you work for an animal rights group? I'm going to lie and say no. And then I would be violating the law. Now, there's some more insidious ag laws. For example, the ones that say, if you see an act of animal abuse, you have to report it within 24 hours. That sounds good, but that is there simply to protect the industry. Because the reason that we do employment-based cases is because when you see a crime, you want to make sure. Well, first of all, as I'll explain in a bit, it's very difficult at times to understand what is a crime and what is not. And so you have to take time to identify it. You can't really do that in 24 hours. You also want to determine, is there a pattern of criminal activity? Who else is engaged in criminal activity? Is management or are the owners aware of it, right? So let's just say that someone has, like with that calf ranch I worked at in Texas years ago, people would use blunt force trauma with hammers to euthanize calves. It's legal, or they'd shoot the calves in the head. It's legal, but they would do it properly. So I go over to the dead pile, and because I'm working at the place, and I see these calves with bullet wounds, or their caves are partially, their skulls are partially caved in, and they're still breathing, right? Now we can have a crime. But what I had to do was I had to go to the owner, and I had to say, hey, this is what's happening. There's this calf. Is it properly euthanized? Something needs to be done. And then his response was, yeah, we'll get to it the next day. So I had to wait over 24 hours. And I had to determine, is anything done? In fact, nothing is done. That led to a cruelty charge that stuck on the owner, right? But I had to be there for quite some time. So that's why these ag laws, they're a big concern. But they're constantly getting overturned. Recording laws, you have to know your recording laws. For example, here in Massachusetts, I cannot record audio without the consent of all parties, right? In some places, you can't use hidden video cameras. In other states, it's a little more iffy. For example, California and Florida, right? Those are like the one-party consent states, but they have a different statute than you have here in Massachusetts. You cannot record audio. You can record video all you want. Or I could go into your home. If you're in California, I could go into your home on your property and record video, that's fine. But I can't record audio of our conversation unless you have no reasonable expectation of privacy. So, I went to like 40 pet stores in California a couple years ago for the Humane Animal Protection Society. And I recorded audio all day long, right? Because customers were going in and out of those stores, and I felt they have no reasonable expectation of privacy, so no one is sued. I did the same thing in Florida, right? But several stores that I walk into, they had these weird establishments where I'd hit a doorbell, and someone unlocks the door, and then I'd look inside, and I would see no one else inside. And after I stepped in, I noticed that the guy shut and locked the door, so I killed my recording. Because I realized at that point there's a reasonable expectation of privacy that no one can walk through that locked door. If the door was unlocked, it might be reasonable to assume anyone could walk through at any point, so I'll record audio all day long, right? It gets a little trickier when I remember I went to an illegal slaughterhouse in California, and I had to convince the guy that I wasn't a cop, and then he was very concerned about, he was illegally butchering animals for people, and I had to get him to admit that he was doing it, I had to document him doing it, and it was his private residence, right? And members of the public were coming and going, but he had to allow them on. So I brought a trainee with me that I was training, and I had her stand aside just within earshot so I could record his confession that he knew he was operating illegally and document the animal cruelty. And then I gave it over to the DA's office in Los Angeles County, California, and I said to the ADA handling the case, the assistant district attorney handling the case, listen, I want to get a witness for you. I understand what I did is a little sketchy, but I want to continue to be a good witness. Is this okay? And her response to me was, we choose who to prosecute. We are choosing to not prosecute you, right? I don't know if I broke the law or not. But those kinds of things come up in investigations, right? I don't think I did, but, who's to say? Trespassing laws. Trespassing laws can be a little difficult to deal with if it's that you can't misrepresent yourself to obtain access to someone's property, but it can be a lot more shady than that. In Missouri, if you unknowingly enter someone's property and they have no signs posted and they have no fence, you have committed criminal trespass. It's mind-blowing, right? It means that if you walk onto someone's front yard in Missouri and they don't want you there, you just broke the law and you can be arrested, right? So it's a little tough when I go to puppy mills in Missouri, right? It's kind of hard. Whereas there's many other states where the laws will be very specific. They'll say that trespass means that they have to have told you to leave, right? Or you have to cross the fence. Or there has to be a no trespassing sign that you saw. Or they can have paint markings, like a purple paint marking, but it has to be between here and here, and it has to be spaced every 50 feet out, right? Or previously, the owner has said, don't come back. Or the land is currently being used for an agricultural purpose. You can't go walking through the guy's cornfield, right? Now, what that means to me is that if you don't have a fence and you don't have a sign and that's the law, I am going to walk right the hell on your property and I'm okay. But I have sat in the back of many police cars arguing the law with many cops, and it has always been very tense situations, and I was convicted in one of those instances, but it's now expunged. But I did not break the law. In fact, the guy whose property was on threw a shovel at me and had his guard dog chasing me, and he was not arrested, but I was. But so now let me go over what we're looking for. I don't have time, unfortunately, this will take about an hour to go through all this, but I just wanted to use this to illustrate that for those of you who you work for an NGO, or you're looking to go work for an NGO, if you have someone, if say you're with a group who you're breaking into a new industry that you haven't investigated before, or that NGO has not done an investigation before, there are some exceptions, but please hear me out on this. If by now it has been done, and when we go into a facility, we are looking for predictable criminal activity. You go into any kind of commercial animal operation, the more human contact with the animals, the more cruelty and abuse, the more physical abuse there's going to be. The less human contact with the animals, the more neglect. There are specific things that we're looking for. I'll just give you a couple examples here. Like at an egg farm, I've worked in 3 egg farms. Two of them were caged and had cage-free barns. One of them was just caged. It didn't matter. What I was looking for was hens that were almost dead but not quite dead. And as someone's going through the trash can, they're picking them up and they're throwing the dead in the trash cans, they're going to take the ones that are partially alive, and they don't always euthanize them, because to euthanize a hen, you're supposed to swing them around by the neck, or when you do that, the feces goes in a big circle, right? So nobody wants to get the place dirty, so they throw them alive in the trash can, they bury them in their own dead. This is the go-to crime to look for at any egg farm that you go to. If you are going to a hog farm, anyone who knows anything about undercover work and the movement knows you're looking for abuse, physical abuse of the sows from gestation to farrowing. You're looking for wounds that are not treated. You're looking for improper euthanization when they thumped the piglets that they smacked them once and then they left them to suffer because they're improperly killed. There's typical things that we're going for. And what I really want to focus on, why I don't want to hound this, is I want to go through it again and I want to explain to you why crimes are so common and so predictable on commercial facilities. It's not just that we're looking to show that things look bad, we're looking for specific crimes. But there are 2 types of evidence that we go for. We have criminal evidence and we go for campaign evidence. So this picture on the left, this is a puppy mill that I worked at, and this is a bull mastiff. He had gotten skinny, and the puppy miller didn't really do anything for him. I reported the dog's condition, right? So it took more than 24 hours to handle this, right? I had to show that this dog is in deteriorating condition. I had to report the dog's condition. I had to show out of the process of a few days, the puppy miller didn't take the dog to the vet, didn't have the vet come by, and was aware that the dog was in deteriorating condition until he started vomiting blood and seizing. At this point, I put him in the back of a truck, and the puppy miller's husband went to go shoot him in the head. There were multiple charges brought against her, but this is one of them that nailed her on a torture charge under Minnesota state law. So, for cruelty like that, obviously it's useful to law enforcement, but what it's also useful for is that, and this is my big point, it is useful to the public, right? Because if you want to ask, what is wrong with puppy mills? I mean, what really happens there? There's a lot of footage we have of them, but this case that I did was at Kathy Bouck's puppy mill, pick of the litter. It's the only undercover employment-based case ever done at a puppy mill. So I got to see the day in, day out, for 8 weeks, what goes on, and that information is useful to the public, right? But furthermore, the fact that there was so much criminal evidence that was obtained, that validates the investigation by itself. And if the case is validated, that makes it useful to the legislator as well, right? Now I put this final point here because I feel like we were remiss if I didn't say this. There are a lot of animal rights groups that very much disagree with me on this point. They believe that criminal evidence distracts from a campaign goal. Their goal, for example, might be to say at a hog farm, do away with all gestation crates, right? And so they say that if you focus on the crimes, you're distracting from that. From what I've personally seen, focusing on those crimes when law enforcement takes action, it increases the chance the press is going to show what's going on. More people are then going to pay attention, and then you're more likely to get legislative action. Also, as an investigator, I have to say it's a big deal for me because it validates what we do. One of the biggest problems I encounter when I go out in the field is law enforcement not taking me seriously because they think that most animal rights groups are a bunch of, they're out there only to make someone look bad, right? Criminal evidence is different. Whereas this, the campaign evidence, as you can see, this is a shot I got of this chicken. I took this in Brazil. She's in a battery cage. I focused the camera really nice to get her face and show an individual chicken, and it is useful for this PowerPoint presentation. That's it. Right? That's all we got. I'm trying to do a cage thing in Brazil. Nothing happened, right? I bet that if there was a focus by law enforcement on crimes that were being committed at those facilities, which we did see some, maybe it could have been a different outcome. So, how do you know what's cruelty and what's not? Right? This guy, this is a still from a video I took from a hog farm I worked at in Oklahoma a few years ago. There's a lot of abuse there, but this particular sow, she came out of her gestation crate. She starts to go down the hall. She's going to go to farrowing, and she knows where she's going to go, and she stops. She doesn't want to go there, so she wants to run around the gestation barn. So this guy starts poking her in the eyes, ripping tufts of hair out of her back, and drop kicking her in the face, as you can see here. That's illegal. Illegal abuse causes unnecessary suffering, right? And that's going to be the main thing you're going to go for in cruelty cases. So if you have a sow who is when they rub up against the bars of the farrowing crate, the gestation crate, they get open sores, and they're not being treated, and they're wounded, they're suffering, that's unnecessary suffering, right? You can use that for neglect. If they thumb a piglet, right, and it's illegal to use blunt force trauma, the piglet's still alive. You come back 10 minutes later, 30 minutes later. That's unnecessary suffering, especially if someone's aware of it and doesn't do something about it. But if you want to keep that same sow in this tiny crate so she barely has an inch to move, that's fine. You want to take her piglets from her, you want to rip the testicles out with an anesthetic, that's perfectly fine. because those are standard industry practices. Standard industry practices are always going to be an affirmative defense to a cruelty charge because it's going to be written into the state law, and it's going to say, if this is normal, then it's okay. This gets sketchy when you go to court. And this is going to be really sketchy when you're writing the reports and you're trying to help out your NGO in a cruelty case. The way I like to explain this is, anybody here have martial arts experience? Raise your hand if you have any martial arts experience. One. I'll try to use for an example. For a brief bit, I was a volunteer firefighter, and when I go to the academy, we had to do all these things. We had to take all these different courses, and we had to learn to do every little thing that you wanted in firefighting, right? And part of the reason that we had to go over every little thing was just OSHA. That was it. They wanted to say that we could check off the list and say, we know how to do this, and that we're going to do it properly, and then we get a call and we go somewhere, and no one would do a fucking thing that we learned in training, right? And what I learned was that they would always say, there's book world, and there's real world. And I'm sorry to say that that is the same for the law. The law, as many of you are learning as you're going through classes, it's a big gray area. And the law, and animal cruelty included, does not have as much to do with what's actually written in the books as it does with the individual personalities of law enforcement officers, prosecutors, and judges. They will interpret it however the hell they want. And they are people, and people are easily corrupted. So let's just say, let's stick with the hog farm. Let's stick with this hog farm that I was at, right? I watched the Tyson vet come in one day, recorded the whole thing. I'm not making this up. Tyson vet comes in, and they're talking about this one down sow. She's in terrible shape. She's obviously suffering. They're not giving her any medicine because there's going to be too long of a withdrawal time. I forget the medicine, but it had like a month withdrawal time. So if you would give this antibiotic to the sow to treat her for this prolapsed vagina that she had, and then send her to slaughter after the month. By then the chemical will be out of her system. But for reasons unknown to me, all of a sudden that changed. Now there's a 3-month withdrawal time. So the Tyson vet is explaining to the farm owner, you just gotta make that call. Do you think she's suffering too bad? Do you think she'll make it if you just don't give her the medicine? Do you want to just kill her here and lose the money? You just make that call, right? So was it illegal to not euthanize her? Should he euthanize her? Was it unnecessary suffering? It's kind of hard to say. It seems to me like it is, but the local DA did not believe that it was, and wouldn't even take the case for this and numerous other crimes. Just decided, no, that's what you do to move a sow that won't move, right? I remember when I was at a dairy, I'll show you the picture shortly, but I was at a dairy within 45 minutes of showing up at the dairy, I see a down cow. And one of the things that I saw was that the foreman of the facility pulled out a taser and shot the cow over 50 times, put a chain around her neck, and dragged her out, right? And so there were charges brought against a lot of the workers, but not this guy. And so I went to go testify against one of the workers. He pled out when he realized I was there to testify, but I went to go testify. And I'm waiting there, and I speak to Sheriff Brown of the Twin Falls County Sheriff's Department, and I say, why did you not recommend the DA bring charges against this guy for what he did to that downed cow? And his response to me was, that's what I do to cows that won't stand on my ranch. So that's just how he interpreted the law, right? So, hope that answers all your questions. Sorry, limited time. So now what I'm going to do is I want to talk about the Animal Welfare Act. Raise your hand if you know what the Animal Welfare Act is. Okay, now keep your hand up if you know that law enforcement cannot enforce the Animal Welfare Act. Okay, so a few of you. So I'm gonna, for those of you who know this, sorry, order. I'm gonna hound this point. This will be important. Okay, so this applies only to USDA licensed facilities, U.S. Department of Agriculture licenses certain facilities. Not farms like CAFOs, like a hog farm or a broiler farm. Certain facilities, things that have to do with agriculture, like, circuses, and labs. Right? That's just that. For some reason, that's what they license. They also license dog breeding kennels. Now that one kind of makes sense because you're a commercial dog breeding kennel. If you're selling dogs to puppy a certain way and a certain number of them, those dogs, they're going to be livestock under most state law, right? So it kind of makes sense why they license them. But any facility they license, the animal welfare applies. It talks about what you can do with your tiger in your, at your exhibition facility, or what you can do with your dogs at your puppy mill. And so, for example, you have a few violations up here, right? This dog has a wounded ear, and it had not been tended. It was a big, giant infection on the ear. There's peeling paint. There's over 24 hours of manure on the floor, and there's rusting cage wire. That's 4 violations that are right there, right? But this often confuses law enforcement. The USDA enforces the Animal Welfare Act. Their own specific set of regulations for their licensees. You have a puppy mill, all right? So I show up at your puppy mill, and I'm like, all right, I see a cobweb all over the place, and it's too dark in here, I can't see clearly. There's 2 violations, a lighting violation, and then you have cobweb. That's a general facility violation. But I also see you have this dog over here, and she's got an open wound, and I ask you about it, and you're like, fuck her, I don't care, she won't breathe for me, not being treated. And so I say, okay, now we have a third Animal Welfare Act violation. That's a violation of 2.4 of vet care, of the Animal Welfare Act regulations. But, in addition to that, he was causing unnecessary suffering to this dog. That is a violation of the state cruelty statute. So who enforces what? The USDA enforces the cobweb, lighting, and vet care violation for the Animal Welfare Act. The local sheriff's department should enforce the state cruelty statute, also for the Vet Care Act, but it's not for the vet care violation. That has nothing to do with the Animal Welfare Act. It has to do with the fact that that violated the state cruelty statute. Raise your hand if I'm confusing the hell out of you right now. Okay, so it confuses most law enforcement officers. Most law enforcement officers, most rural sheriffs, when I show up and say, okay, I saw this dog. This dog is suffering terribly and is dying and untreated wounds. Something needs to be done. And the cop will say to me, all right, well, you should go to the USDA. All right, maybe the USDA should do something because it's an animal welfare violation. But if I was, let's just say these are your dogs, and I go up to you and I want to, like if I'm a USDA inspector, I can say, for your dying dog, you have a dog that is dying, you neglect the dog, you kicked the dog in front of me, right? So obvious what you just did. And I say, okay, that's a veterinary care violation of the Animal Welfare Act. And you have some rusting cage wire, right? And you have too much poop on her. I'm lighting you up. That's a fine for you. I'm fining you. And if I really, really want, which they won't, and I'll explain this in a minute, they won't, but I could say, I recommend that I suspend or terminate your USDA license. And that means that if all of that happened, maybe you wouldn't be breeding dogs. There's no jail time. Because as a USDA inspector, I'm not a cop. Can I enforce state law? Only the Animal Welfare Act. A cop would walk up and he would say, I don't care about the poop on the ground. There's nothing in the state cruelty statute about poop. And there's nothing in the state cruelty statute about rust. You cannot kick a dog in front of me. So the cop doesn't give a shit about just fining you or whether or not you can keep breeding. The cop hauls your ass to jail. That's a violation of state law. It's 2 very different things. So now also the Animal Welfare Act, just as a side note, has nothing to do with the psychological well-being of dogs. So for all you lawyers out there, that's a big thing for me. As you can see this picture in the bottom left, this is a very typical style of puppy mill. And what you'll see is normally you have dogs where they'll have a little inside cage, and then they have an outside cage, and it's a very common thing we call them spinners, where I don't know why, but it's always in left-hand circles. The dogs just run in left-hand circles. And then when you rescue them and you get them out and you put them somewhere, you will see the dogs, and they'll often just run around in a little circle about the size of the enclosure that they used to be in, right? There is nothing, kind of like in most state cruelty statutes, but also in the Federal Animal Welfare Act, there is nothing in there about the psychological well-being of any animals whatsoever. So that's something that needs to change. But also, the USDA changes how they enforce the Animal Welfare Act specifically to make it less effective. We get a little bit into the weeds here, but this is what I think is important for especially you law students to know. My big client I keep mentioning, the Humane Animal Protection Society, they're also called CAPS. They work with a lot of groups and they pass some laws. For example, I got some awesome laws passed that said, all right, if you are a pet store, like say New York City, it passes great laws, or say if you're a pet store, and if you cannot buy from any breeder that has had a direct violation. A direct violation means it's directly on the dog, like a wounded ear, an infected ear, right? Or teeth falling out of their head, right? Or matted fur or something. And you also can't have a certain number of indirect violations. Cobwebs, lighting, rust, things like that, right? If we see you had 4 or more indirect violations or 1 direct, the pet store can't buy from them, right? So that's going to cut down big business. I would enter out in the field and I'd see, holy shit, there's less puppy mills. These places are closing down because they can't sell the pet stores anymore. So the USDA changed how they enforce the Animal Welfare Act. Then what they did is they said, fine, the biggest direct violations that exist are bad teeth rotting out of dogs' heads, and matted fur that causes skin conditions. And the USDA now says those no longer count as direct violations. They don't even write you up for it. But what they also said is that, okay, go back to your bungalow. You got cobwebs, you got shitty lighting, and I say, those are violations. Listen, do you think you can fix that soon? And if you just say yes, I call that a teachable moment. And then I literally, that's the actual phrase. I don't even write it in my report. And the reason I don't write it in my report is that way it can't be forwarded. No one can ever find out about your place, so no activist can ever get that information and go to a pet store and say, bullshit, this breeder has violations. It protects the industry that they are supposed to inspect and enforce their own regulations on, and thereby keeps them in business. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's the big problems we have with AWA, and that's what needs to change there. Now, got a little bit of time. Okay, now I'm going to get into what I'm very excited to talk about. I kind of rushed through that, so I can talk about this. This is the big thing for me. Is that why everybody commits so much abuse? I remember I started doing this back in 2001, and it was for every case that I've worked, there's a lot of stuff I've seen that, like I say, is predictable, but I've also just seen, and I don't know how else to explain this, a lot of weird, crazy shit. A lot of moving cattle, that's crazy. I've seen a guy pitchforking cows. I've seen people submerging dogs in insecticide instead of, because they're like, well, that means that you're dipping the dog, right? When it clearly says on the label you're supposed to spray the dog's enclosure. I mean, just I worked at a broiler farm where after the catching crew came through, there were a few broilers left over, and for reasons I'll never know, I asked the owner, I said, hey man, you still got a few chickens here, and all the feed lines and the water lines are all up, they can't access it. Do you want me to put it down? Like, what do you want to do? He said, no, just leave them. The raccoons will get them, and the cats will get them in a day or two, and then the coyotes will come and they'll take care of the rest. And for some reason, it was his specific plan to leave them to starve until predators took them, even though he was well aware he had an E. coli outbreak on that farm, right? It was going to spread to wildlife. I can never explain why the hell the guy did that. I mean, but that kind of thing we see commonly, and I think what I can try to do is I can try to explain why is a common thread so much crazy stuff that goes on. Working conditions, situations that the workers are in, the culture of the community, problems with law enforcement, problems with the government. Let's go over them in detail one by one. Okay? Alright. So, alright, working conditions. This is the cow I was telling you about at the very shot and drag out. So at this dairy, as an example, this was called Betancourt Dairy, and I was day shift, and I worked 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. My job was, I was the runner, and I was supposed to go, and I had to get all the cows from every pen into the dairy, into the milking parlor, and get them back out. Now, there were 2 milking parlors, and they had to be 2 because there were over 10,000 cows in this dairy, right? So we had over 5,000 we had to do just for my parlor. When I showed up at 6 a.m. in the morning, we were standing there and patiently waiting for everyone to clean up the parlor, and I was following the night runner to get his damn cows out of the way so I could get mine through, right? And at the end of the day at 6 p.m., the same thing. The night runner was just right there on my heels waiting for me to just hurry up and finish. Even though we worked that hard, we had no time for breaks. A little taco truck would come by and we'd get a plate of food, and we would fill our mouths with food, and then we'd be chewing as we're running over and we're milking cows, right? There is stress, there is sleep deprivation, you are hungry as hell. And on top of it, for a lot of these workers, I think the USDA Department says that about half the agricultural workforce is illegal immigrants. In my personal experience, just from CAFOs, I'd say I've seen closer to 90% of the people that I work with are illegal immigrants. And guys, I mean, it's most of them may not have smartphones, they don't have TV, they don't have computers. I mean, they got nothing to go back home to, right? Life is not that great for them. And they are tired, they are worn out, and then this cow falls over. She's just being lazy, right? Or this cow goes in the wrong stall, or this fucking sow knows she's supposed to go out of this crate and go into the other one, right? And you may be otherwise a good person who treats your family, your friends, and your coworkers very, very well, but you're not going to treat that animal well in that moment because you're going to get in a lot of trouble if you don't just make that animal move, right? And that is just a big reason why we so commonly see people do these things that we otherwise can't believe. It's just the conditions. On top of it, the criminal history and immigration status of workers. So, I've never worked a single undercover case, an employment-based undercover case ever in my life where I did not see routine criminal animal cruelty, right? So you're going to see it. Throw a dart in the map, whatever CAFO, slaughterhouse is closest. You know, there's crimes going on, right? So you're there, but if you're a felon, what the hell are you going to do about it, right? Can't vote, can't own a gun, can't get a good job. You're pretty screwed. Are you really going to rat out your coworkers now? Not only are you a felon, you're a rat, right? So you just let it go. And that perpetuates the abuse. If you're an illegal immigrant, you literally have no right to do anything. I mean, you're just going to get thrown out of the country and no one's going to listen to you anyway. So you just kind of tolerate it. And that is part of what makes a culture of cruelty. This is a still from the video I took where I worked at the Pontotoc Stockyards, which is a livestock auction in Mississippi back in 2014. Now, I was working at 3 livestock auctions at that time, Pontotoc and 2 others that were south of there. And this specific incident, this was a little down bull calf, and he came down, and so you see that this guy is one of the workers, this is the customer who purchased the bull. This guy is using a front end loader to lift up the bull and try to put it in the trailer. 4th time was a charm. 3 times that guy flipped off. His head slammed against the side of the gate, he collapsed on the ground. Now that's not the crazy thing, here's the crazy thing. You see those trees over there on the right? That's a road. Over here is Highway 276, a major highway in Mississippi. And right back here is everyone else in the fucking livestock auction. Customers, employees, everyone. No one cared. Most of the crew, the vast majority of the crew at auction were teenage kids. And at a livestock auction, the go-to crime you look for is you're looking for abuse of small animals. Abuse of down animals is a good kind, but small animals get abused because they can't really hurt you back. A cow will kick the shit out of you. What is a goat really going to do? grab by the horns and people throw them, or a sheep or a little pig, right? So it was a lot of beating them with sticks, punching, kicking them, throwing them, a lot of stuff like that, right? And so, not only would the employees do it, but I would see customers do it or order employees to do it. Like, take that fucking thing, it won't move, right? And these are a bunch of little teenagers, and they were so respectful to me. I was much older than them. They would call me sir. They were like, they would always want to listen to what I have to say, right? But they were terrible, these animals. Now, they committed the same crimes that the crew did who worked the other two livestock auctions I was at. The difference is, at this place, Pontotoc, that was a bunch of white high school kids. The other two auctions were all black felons. Those guys got convicted. The white teenagers did not, right? And so it was the culture. So to be clear with my point on it, is that part of the problem with the culture there is that it wasn't just the workers in the local community, it was also law enforcement. It was the cops, the DA's office, it was everybody, right? Just like with this big girl, when no one cared about her because the local sheriff just decided, the local sheriff was someone who he didn't want to prosecute someone, he didn't want to prosecute a foreman in a big company, right? Now we get to, rushing down. Now we get to law enforcement athlete corruption. Let me just say, if anyone here is in law enforcement or has family and friends in law enforcement, I do not mean to offend you. I love law enforcement. I have a lot of friends who are at all levels of law enforcement. I love law enforcement so much that I have tried to leave my job to apply to become a cop. Really love law enforcement. That said, I deal with an enormous amount of apathy and corruption, especially in rural America. Rural sheriff's department is the biggest problem that I come across. So briefly, this is a still, sorry it's a little fuzzy, but this is a still took of a puppy mill I was at called Lord's Puppy Land. You can see the full video on the CAPS website. This is back in 2007. I showed up at this puppy mill, and I couldn't record audio because they don't really say law. But Betty Lord was showing their dogs, and I look at this cage, and there's this little puppy, this little chihuahua, got her legs up in the air, and she's just seizing and shaking, right? So, that's a problem, right? But so I asked, is she doing anything for the puppy? Because if she's treating the puppy, it might not be a violation. She might be aware of just treating it. But she said to me, no. Like sometimes they just don't make it. And she expected the puppy to die. Okay, dying puppy, she's not doing anything. That's an imminent threat to life situation. That means law enforcement needs to respond immediately. So I leave. I call animal control, I report the situation, and say that we're on it. But I sit there at a crossroad for about 10 minutes and wait, and I don't see a car come by. So I call them again. And we're on it, we're responding to their calls. It's an affect the life situation, so I'm calling the answer. So I drive over to animal control, and when I get to animal control, the local head of the animal control facility tells me that she's angry at me for filming this place. And she accuses me of breaking the law for filming her. And I say that I'm not. And I realize, shit, they're not going to do anything. So I go to the sheriff's department. When I go to the sheriff's department, the local sheriff says, yeah, I'm just not going to do anything. I'm going to refer it to the state ag guy. You can go to him if you want. So I go to the state ag guy, who doesn't enforce cruelty statutes. He just enforces his kennel licensing. And he tells me, I don't like the group that you're working for, and when I was out there 3 days ago, I didn't see that problem, so I'm not going to do anything. So I go to the state attorney's office immediately afterwards, and the state attorney, as I'm talking to him, he sits there and types on his laptop, and flips his laptop around, and he shows me that previously my client had badmouthed him on the internet for doing the same damn thing, for us reporting cruelty to him, and he did nothing about it. I went to animal control, went to the sheriff, went to the state ag, went to the state attorney, and no one would do anything for one dying puppy. And I am sorry to say, but that is the norm in the United States. It's just how it is here. You go to, even for dogs, it's now in Boston, Massachusetts, it's different. Someone was to kick a dog on the street out here in Boston, I bet you the Boston PD would just pound that guy in the ground. do it in rural America, especially to dogs that are livestock, that are at a commercial facility, most of the time nothing's going to be done. That's why employment-based investigations that take longer than 24 hours to do are so important, to show a pattern of abuse and everyone who's involved to compel local LE, local law enforcement to do something. Finally, real quick, government corruption. I talked a bit about the USDA. That's what I mean by government corruption. The USDA changing how they enforce the Welfare Act is an example of that, but I hate to say this, it's a lot more insidious than that. I know it sounds like I'm making this up, but I'm just here to tell you, it's most of the time, it doesn't matter if it's a commercial fishing boat, you're talking about a state inspector, it doesn't matter if you're talking about a federal USDA inspector enforcing the EWA, most of the time they're just not going to do anything because, okay, go back to your puppy mill. This guy's a terrible puppy mill. If I'm inspecting your puppy mill, I know the story behind this, I don't have time to tell it, but if I go to your puppy mill, I know you now. Right, you're my buddy. I gotta see you every year, and I gotta see her puppy mill. I gotta see her puppy mill, right? I don't want to be a guy that everybody hates because I live in the state. So I'm gonna kind of let things go, right? I'm just not. It's easier for me to not worry about problems, right? Otherwise, especially, let's just say that slaughterhouse, right? This is a slaughterhouse I was at. Sorry, I'm not tying the whole story. If I go to your slaughterhouse and I have to stand there, and I have to watch over your shoulder and watch for violations, you are going to make it very uncomfortable for me to be there in a 10-hour shift for every little thing that I'm pointing out. My life is going to be hell, so I let it go. I just don't care. I saw the same thing with commercial fishing boats. I saw people who were, a guy was bragging about shooting sea lions with a shotgun, and the state inspector was just laughing about it. Saying, you gotta defend yourself from those vicious sea lions. So, because of all of these reasons, we can predict violations of the law, and we can predict specific violations. That is my presentation.
And just to follow up, and what people saying about the USDA changing their inspections criteria and writing up violations, the head of USDA, this animal care at the time, said that the reason they were doing so is because all of these municipal laws that saying you couldn't purchase from a breed that had these violations, they said they were hindering the USDA's clients from getting their products to market, and that the USDA felt that their job was to help them get their products to market, so they're just going to stop writing violations. I mean, USDA has this perverse sort of job of both regulating and promoting agriculture, and I think that statement pretty clearly shows which side they come down on. So, anyone has to leave the class, feel free to do so, and we'll ask some questions. If you just put up your hand and we try to bring you the mic for the question, because we're recording like for that too. So, first question.
I'm just wondering, do you have any experience with wildlife violations in terms of hunting permits and stuff like that? And I also am wondering if you've been blacklisted by these places in terms of employment.
No, yes. The only wildlife experience I have is commercial fishing. I don't have. I have limited. The only other wildlife experience I have is fox penning, where they have the foxes and the coyotes put into pens, and then dogs chase them to see how many dogs can corner them and get close to them and you score points for them as they chase them. But that's about it. No poaching experience. As far as being blacklisted, yeah. Yeah, they got my name and all my info and everything, and I can't go into a lot of methodology, but it's just that it's constant work. It's constant work to get around that. And from 2001 until 2010, what a lot of individual targets, but also a lot of companies in the industry would do is they'd say they're making this up, right? Because again, some of this stuff that we see is just, it defies common sense. I mean, it's like you know, I'm willing to explain all that stuff at the end to explain why you do this to animals you make money off of, right? You know you're going to get in trouble. You know there's investigators out there, but it just defies common sense. And so they would say, you're making this up, you doctored this video, you staged this. And 2010 was a turning point, and I worked at a calf ranch, and I saw some really horrible stuff. And unlike a lot of previous cases, law enforcement took the case, and they prosecuted the owner. And there was, I believe it was the National Beef Association, I believe, came out. They had a YouTube video. The VP of the organization came out and he said, we can no longer say these are isolated incidents. We now have to recognize that that we have a problem, a systemic problem. That was 2011. And so I think since then, it's been, they still try to keep us out. But for me, that was big because that was a recognition that when they're trying to keep us out, you know, what they're trying to do is they're not just trying to protect their interests, they're trying to cover up the crimes.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I'm so sorry. Did you have your hand up?
I did.
Yes, ma'am. I'm so sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, first of all, I wanted to know if there is an agency that we connect you with. What's the name of or did you already tell us that?
Oh, no, I work for various nonprofits that are my clients.
So, as far as a website, if we were to seek out your help because we knew of places that we'd like to see you look into, we couldn't do that.
Well, if you're here, you'd be here. But normally it's that you would contact a group that I've worked for, and then.
But you haven't told us who that is.
I work for Companion Animal Protection Society.
Oh, that you did mention those.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, animal equality.
And then the other one is the people in the state of Illinois. They raise hogs. They have milk dairy farms and. They raise cattle for butchering and so on. Don't they have like teams of regular inspectors that go in and check on whether or not there's? You're talking about that there's rampant cruelty in the industry. That when we go shopping at the grocery store, we're eating chickens that have been abused or
absolutely.
That's what you're talking about.
Yeah, so there's no
There's just not enough going on.
There's no inspectors at the facilities that raise the animals, right? At the broiler farm, the hog farm, the egg farm, there's no inspectors there to look at the animals there. They are going to try to look at the animals, or they should, at the slaughterhouse. I have worked at a lot of slaughterhouses, and it's just extremely rare for one to get cited. And most of the time, it's for the reasons that I mentioned before, that the inspector just doesn't want to cause problems at the slaughterhouse. What's that? Oh yeah, the suspension is a day. It's like you get suspended briefly and that's it. It's not like they shut you down. You have to have massive routine violations from an undercover employment-based case to reveal them to have a place to shut down.
Thank you so much for your work and your talk today. I'm interested in what you said about the culture of cruelty that you've surmised in all of your work experience. There's also another sort of culture that we think we have in America of that we love animals. You know, and I just wonder if you have thought of how that squares. Like those two things, those opposite things, right? Like a culture of cruelty, what you're talking about, what we've uncovered, and then just this, I think everybody thinks that, you know, Americans, Canadians, whatever, we all love animals. That's another, like, how does that square?
So you know that old saying everyone always has of, if slaughterhouses had glass walls, everyone would be vegetarian. Everyone says that. That's bullshit. Because people work in the slaughterhouses. Communities work in the slaughterhouses. Right? They have rotating doors of workers. Everyone goes in, goes to work, comes out, and then eats meat. There is a lot to change desensitization. When I train investigators, I will tell them that there's some things I'll have to prepare them for that they'll have to mentally get ready for, but witnessing animal abuse is not wrong. You get desensitized so quick. You're stressed, you're tired, and you're, especially if you're doing an undercover job, your adrenaline is up, right? So that changes how you think. But if you're already not vegetarian or vegan, you don't have to worry. You're just kind of following the flow of what people say and what people do. And as you get into the groove of it, you stop seeing them as individual animals. That's another truck, right? It's not an animal, it's a truck. How many trucks we got left? Are we done? Okay, we're done. And it's easier to go along with the group mentality than you would imagine. And so it is also pretty easy to slaughter animals commercially or hunt and kill animals and then go home and then really love your dog. That does not make someone a bad person or mean they're warped. That's a pretty easy thing for most people to do. So I don't think the effort isn't finding what makes anyone bad so that they do that. The effort is how do we try to make people what we believe is better by having more empathy for one's they do.
Thank you. You mentioned that almost 90% of the people working in these slaughterhouses are either undocumented immigrants or people with felony convictions. And I'm wondering if you have any concerns about bringing criminal charges against people who might already be among the most vulnerable people in our society who you mentioned are forced to do this work because of lack of any sort of other options. And especially if those criminal convictions against someone could result in their deportation.
Yeah, I do, but it's a tough situation, obviously, and one of the reasons that I don't flip out about it is if it's an ex-con, a felon, and then they're going to get hit with a misdemeanor cruelty charge, it's not going to tear them up too bad, right? That sucks, but it's not going to tear them up too bad. And so saying I don't want a cruelty charge to happen, right? And I just want to expose this, they broke the law and I don't lose sleep at night, okay, I hate that charge. Now the illegal immigrant, to be honest, in my experience, they run and they never get followed, right? I mean, they take off and I worked in a place in Panhandle, Texas, and one guy told me he was from Chicago, the other from Miami, and the other from Boston. What the hell are they doing in Castro County, Texas, in Panhandle, right? I mean, they ran, and when they ran from that case, nobody followed them. I feel for them, and that's terrible, but the unfortunate reality is that when it comes to cruelty to animals, we have to make a choice, right? There might be two victims here. There might be they're a victim of the system, and the animals are a victim of the system, but the animals are also victims of their crimes. So do we let our empathy for these individuals take over our urge to have justice done for these animals? And I would say no. That's why I promote veganism, so just do away with this.
There was a movie made by Winkletter, I think his name is, and it's called Fast Food Nation, and it talked about what the lives of the immigrants, the illegal, who worked at these horrible places. Their lives are so horrible, and sometimes they really regret doing so. It's not a life you want to protect, really. The other thing is, the other thing I wanted to mention is that these horrible things that people do to animals, it reminds me of the Nazis, because people who were Nazis and doing horrible things to their fellow human beings would go home and be good family men. So it's something, we are really mental human beings are crazy.
There's a big giant, there's an argument about this, and I have to say I know I'm on one side of it, that I think insanity is the norm. I think that the average person, anybody in this room, we're just kind of waiting to get, hopefully we don't go at any point in our lives having to do it, but we're all just waiting to find what's the lowest point. And when you hit that lowest point, something's going to break you, right? It takes an enormous amount of willpower to not give in, and it's few people that don't. The most common interrogation techniques are sleep deprivation and starvation. It breaks your will. It makes you susceptible to suggestion, right? You are hungry and you are tired, and someone says, just keep the fucking cow, and so you do it. That's another real concern people have working undercover, is someone tells you to do something and you're working undercover and can you do it or not? Is that legal or not? Right? How do you get away with that? How do you maintain your cover but not break the law? I mean, you have to know it pretty well. You have to deal with those situations as it becomes. It's tough. But for the average person, I think that the average person, we think about what it's like to be in a violent situation and to see violence and to have threat of violence on us or to have to engage in violence. And most of us know it through movies and TV shows. But when it happens, it is completely different than you would think. And not only that, it's very different the moment after it happens than a month later or a year later. You think about it completely differently. But what is also very different is if you have that situation day after day after day after day, then you don't even remember how you were thinking about it the week or the month before. It's just something else entirely.
Kind of deadens you.
Absolutely.
Just one other thing, I forget what it was, but yeah, custom, you say, is a really huge obstacle because people do what has always been done, and they do what they see others do. So if that seems like the biggest obstacle, what would you suggest?
Okay, here's what I would say. I would say that I understand for example, for the illegal immigrants who maybe, nobody wants them to have a charge brought on them. I get it, and I don't, and nobody wants for someone like kids at the Pottertuck stockyard I work at, or a local community that thrives solely on the business of this one slaughterhouse. Like, nobody wants to see them get hurt. And I don't want to say that there's got to be collateral damage, but I think the best way that I can put this is that the truth is the truth, and it doesn't matter. The consequences of the truth don't change what the truth is, right? We either are going to know what's happening or not, right? So we either recognize what's happening to these animals and who is responsible, or we're too uncomfortable with that, and then we don't want to know. We've all heard people say, my grandparents and their parents had animals on their farm, and they never did bullshit. I'm calling bullshit. It's just that nobody had covert cameras back then. Those was on YouTube. That's it. It's the only difference. Right now, we are able to get cameras in every place and see what's going on, and we either choose to show it and see it or not. Yes, sir.
Okay, yeah, is there much of an issue of whether the industries are monitoring or sending people into talks like this to basically?
Yeah, but there definitely is, but I would obviously I'd have no problem if they were. I mean, they know who I am. So not really too much of a concern. Again, all we have to do is speak the truth. Sorry.
Thank you so much for the presentation, for doing what you do. I have two questions. My first question is, what about malpractices or violations in a laboratory setting where people do experiments on wild organisms like zebrafish or mice? And my second sort of unrelated question is, when it comes to what's being sold in grocery stores, are there sort of labels or tags that can maybe mark that something has been handled ethically?
Right. I've never worked in a lab. I know that there's an enormous amount of exemptions to a cruelty charge, or the cruelty statute. So you can, if you believe that you have to cause pain to get your experiment done, you can just do all kinds of terrible things, physically, psychologically, to animals. There's also an enormous amount of animals that are exempt from the Animal Welfare Act, in the first place. Fish and mice, no one's gonna enforce, the AWA for that. But as far as labels, yeah, none of them mean anything. So the big one that I'm all upset about is that antibiotic-free thing. I do understand why that's a health concern, but from someone who has worked at a lot of farms, antibiotic-free means no veterinary care. That's it, right? Because you have an average chicken barn, you got 24,000 birds in it. Your average battery cage, egg barn, 100,000 birds, 30,000 if it's cage free. And you got some sick ones, you have to put the medicine into the feed, and it has to go to all of them. So you either treat them when they're sick, or you let them suffer. That's it. And if it's pork, it's like you're raising a hog to go to slaughter. It's not, no one does anything in the slaughterhouse. The hog shows up and it's at slaughter. It's not like they're waiting there like, are we going to check limbs? It happens at a hog farm. And again, they're going to say, well shit, if I'm antibiotic free, there's nothing I can do for this animal's wound. I'm just going to let her suffer until she goes to market.
Could you talk a little about the Humane Slaughter Act and the enforcement of that? Is that under the USDA as well?
That's something different. But the Humane Slaughter Act is it's rarely enforced in my experience, and that is, there's specific rules, but the only time I've really seen it enforced is if you're, I'm sorry, it is enforced, but there's going to be like a slight suspension, like a day suspension or a little bit of a fine, but the only time I've ever seen it vehemently enforced is if there's downed hoof stock, like cattle, right, and people are abusing them. That's a violation of the Humane Slaughter Act, but the reason that people jump on that is that they're afraid there could be mad cow disease, and that's why they're down, and that's why things get shut down longer.
And who's the enforcement agency for that?
That is, who handles?
FSIS.
Oh yeah, food safety inspection.
So if hypothetically we had evidence of a violation of the Humane Slaughter Act in Massachusetts, what would your suggestion be to take that evidence to?
FISIS does, they enforce it. They will, but you could report it. My limited experience with them is they're very professional, they'll do their job, and you can go online and you can see places that they hit for inhumane treatment and slaughter. I think they would take it seriously. But what I would say is I would try to contact an animal rights group to determine if you could try to go, and if you had a reason to believe there's a violation, to try to get undercover footage, but do not try to wait a long time on that to try to get it, just because someone's waiting to get footage. It is better to call the authorities and have them try to do something with it than to just sit on it hoping to get the footage. And if you're thinking, if the concern is, I missed my chance, well good, right? Because then maybe they're not going to use animals again, but from my experience, they're always going to. You can go and do a UC case like that.
Actually, here in Massachusetts, you can go to the NSPCA, because if it is a violation of the HMSA, it might also be a violation of the Cruelty Code. And here in Massachusetts, MSPCA does have enforcement powers to investigate.
And you recommend that with local law enforcement?
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I would go all the above. But chances are, law enforcement might be more responsive if it's coming from an organization first. So I would need to try the organizations first, get their opinion. If they don't do anything, go to law enforcement.
I was wondering, in your work, you said it's not uncommon for workers to engage in acts of animal cruelty because they were asked to, essentially, by their employers. Were you ever asked to engage in an act of animal cruelty, and how did you respond?
Differently a lot of different times. I know that, I know a couple times I didn't have to do anything when it was, once at a dairy I was at, people kept telling me to punch and kick the down cows on their wounds. They'd get very upset. And then, because I'd rush over when there's a down cow because I'm trying to film it and I'm just like not doing anything. And so they got upset and they told me to leave. So the next time it happened, I noticed whenever they were down, again, it's dealing with the situation as it is, you have to improvise, but they would often get stuck between the milking stalls, and they'd fall and couldn't get up on the way out, and everyone was just always just beating them in the face and twisting their tails, twisting their down cow's tail till it breaks, is a common thing. And so I ran up, and they had these big gates that are next to them, and only 2 people would lift them, and I just ran up and I lifted it by myself. And then the cow got up, and so it was like a show of machismo, and then they were happy with me, and then they never told me to leave again, even though I wasn't punching them. In another instance, it's that what people were doing is they were being very upset at me for not punching and kicking the cows, and I kept saying, no, it's going to make things worse. They didn't want to hear that from me. And they were cutting, everyone knows you couldn't cut tails off calves a lot when we're going to go into a milking parlor, which, by the way, the dairy industry says that's because the tails will get manure on them, and that manure could then cause an infection, a vaginal infection. It's not the reason. You know the reason whenever you work at a dairy and you are milking a cow and that tail falls into the shit trough and it nails you in the face, that's the reason. Right? How much you other animals would be pissed at the moment that happens. But so what they were doing is they were cutting all the tails off the fully grown cows that still happened. With no anesthetic, they just took garden shears and just knocked it off. And so they got pissed at me for not punching and kicking animals to move them, and they said, all right, Pete, tomorrow, so I've already filmed it, and I would take the rubber bands and put them on the severed nubs of the tails, but I refused to cut them off. And they said, all right, Pete, tomorrow you're going to cut all the tails off every cow that's left here. And that's when I contacted the NGO I was working for, and I said, guys, we're going to the DA, we're done. Whereas on my first case, it was different, and it was that it was a place selling dogs and cats to research labs, and we were going after, there was a lot of abuse, but they were committing federal fraud, was the main crime. We knew that they were having a vet pre-sign veterinary certificates for the dogs to go across state lines to be sold to labs. We just had reason to believe that. But I was undercover so I could get access to their office, which took months, but I could get access to their office and find these pre-signed veterinary forms, right? So when I was reporting directly, I was meeting with the U.S. Attorney's Office, and they just wanted me to stay undercover as long as it took. And one day, one of the things we had to do was they decided to dip all these dogs and dip them into a giant vat of insecticide, and it was below freezing temperatures. So the dogs would get dumped in, and they had ropes around their necks as leashes, and then they would go into shock, and they would get dragged out and just thrown out of the ice in their pens, and I had to do it with them. And the federal prosecutor never told me, you're exempt from the cruelty statute, or we're not bringing charges, or we are. They just took the evidence and didn't say anything, and I just kept going. But nowadays, I don't think the NGO won't really do anything like that.
Have you ever been in fear for your own personal safety doing this work? I don't mean for the animals, I mean for the on the fishing boats, there's this one boat, one of them that was fine, one of them, every time a dead dolphin came up, they told me that if I'm a cop, they're going to drown me. They're like, we're going to tie the same back to your boots, and you're going to go down. And then I've had a guy at a puppy mill attack me with a shovel, and I've had 3 other guys from a puppy mill. They realized I was going and hitting all the different targets in their area, and they saw me pull over on the side of the road, and they ran over and tried to get into my car and steal my keys. And I've had people just get pissed off at work, but we train for that. Or at least I've created training for that. There's different ways to deal with different types of interrogations. I've had people suspect me of something, and then when they accuse me of it, I have to calm them down and then determine if I'm working there, can I calm them down and win them over so that they're going to let this go? Or if it's a walk on them, like a puppy mill, can I calm them down so that I can get to my car and just get the fuck out? Yeah. I just went up to the 24-hour quick reporting in City of Seneca, just to clarify that it's basically just to sort of force investigators to out themselves. The analogy I like to see it is like a DEA agent who spends months infiltrating a a drug distribution ring. It's like forcing them to reveal themselves the moment they see like a $5 drug buy. Like you're never going to get to the importers if that's what you're forced to do.
So thank you for everything that you do. I volunteer at a farm sanctuary and one that rescues like hundreds of animals from slaughterhouses. And so I haven't seen your side of it. I've seen luckily like the more healed side of it. But from my experience, I've seen a lot of cows, especially who literally decades later are still showing signs of like missing their calves that have been taken away from them, like dairy cows. And you talked about psychological well-being. So have you had any experience of like having to separate like a mother pig and her piglets or anything like that? And like how do the animals react to that?
When you separate pigs from sows, the sows get very upset and they will slam themselves against the bars of the farrowing crate to try to bite you and get to you. I mean, they get very visibly upset, taking the calves away from the mother cows. They'll always try to follow and they'll pull against the lead if they're chained to get to something or try to get out of their pen. They're always visibly upset. To me, one of the most touching things was I was working at an egg farm. And I was in a manure pit below it, and so I was down in the manure pit showing how many live chickens had fallen in there and were living in this pit. And it was like this flock of over 30 chickens. And so you can see on the, I use a flashlight, and it's kind of grainy and undercover footage, and I'm following, and as the flock is moving away from me while I'm trying to film them, you see these two chickens off to the side that are sleeping, they have their heads down, and this one hen stops and she kind of looks at me, and she looks at them, and she's like 6 feet from them, and as I approach, she bolts off and nails them. And then when they all wake up, they look at me and they take off. And to me, I really felt like what that meant was that they're moving away from me because they identify me as a threat. And she thought, I'm going to risk myself and I'm going to go wake them up. And that was very touching to me.
Okay, I don't know whether this is a good question, but I heard that in Yugoslavia, in order to teach people how to kill humans, they forced them to slaughter pigs first. Do you feel as if these slaughterhouses make people become more brutal? What is their incident like? Do they volunteer for the military more?
No.
Do you feel as if it is, I mean, personally, I feel as if it not only brutalizes the individual doing it, but the person eating it as well. It's translated into that. There's a whole cultural norm. And I agree with you. I hadn't thought of it in terms of people doing it further, because I used to cut up a chicken every day for Sunday dinner before I became a vegetarian. And now it's so unthinkable. But, and the second question I had was, the Pennsylvania Deutsch, I heard that at one point that even they abuse their animals. Have you ever heard of religious groups that do that sort of thing?
Yeah, the Amish, Pennsylvania Dutch, the Amish, they're the most notorious puppy millers there are. And a vast part of my puppy mill career has been going to Amish. I was just at a few Amish puppy mills in Wisconsin last year. And for them, and they kind of illustrate the point, is that they have horrible puppy mills. They're terrible, but the way that they see it is that working with the earth, and that includes animals, is godly. Working in the dirt or manure, that is godly, right? So it doesn't say in the Bible you're supposed to treat dogs well, but you're supposed to work with the earth. And they're people. They're susceptible to greed, like anyone else, right? So they get a lot of profit off of these animals, but they will just treat these dogs like hell, but then they will be very, very kind to other people. So for the rest of your question, overall I would say no. I think that obviously it's easier to really want to commit an act of violence if you're really used to doing it to animals, but I have not personally felt that just because someone is engaging in violence against animals that I always feel that there's a heightened threat of violence against me. It's usually something else about that individual. Some of my best friends hunt and butcher their own animals. I mean, I disagree with it, but I would never fear that they would want to hurt me or that they would ever hurt their pets. I think there is that's part of the culture is respecting one and not necessarily the other.
Well, in one, they're doing it for their own consumption, like indigenous people. It grosses me out to see it, but at least it's either starvation or do it. And maybe, I don't want to watch it, but necessarily, but I don't know, a culture that does this, to me, is just, it's just over the top.
Well, yeah, we have to understand it, and to me, that's very important, is to say that we cannot judge an entire group of people if they're farmers, they're slaughterhouse workers, or whatever they are, because they grew up differently, they see things differently. It doesn't mean that they can't change it. It doesn't mean that they're otherwise bad people. If someone works at a factory farm or slaughterhouse, it does not mean that they're a bad person. If someone has engaged in animal cruelty, it doesn't mean they're otherwise a bad person or that they can't change. And I think that the more we start to recognize that, the more we try to empathize with them, I think it'll be easier for us to get them to empathize with us.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. I know you mentioned that you had done a lot of international work, and I was wondering what are some of the biggest barriers about working in other countries?
The biggest barriers that I've found, for me, has only been outside the US, it's only been Canada, India, Brazil, Mexico, and the Philippines. But the biggest barriers were probably law enforcement. I mean, I run into a lot of problems with Ellie here in the United States, but I have to say it's just getting them to do something else, outside the U.S. is much more difficult. Doing investigations I found to be much easier. Getting into accessing factory farms and slaughterhouses in other countries. Like, I can't believe I could walk onto them in some places or talk my way into them, whereas in the U.S. is different. But I would say just a total lack of cruelty laws or enforcement of them is the biggest thing. Big cultural difference to overcome in some instances.
Hi, first echoing thanks for your time and for your work. I just wanted to know if you could talk a little bit more about how you first found yourself in undercover work and what inspired you to really pursue this as a career.
I wanted to go into law enforcement. So I wanted to become, I had planned a cop, and after a cop, I'm going to be an FBI agent, and once I'm in the FBI, this is my plan when I was teenager, young adult, okay, once I'm in the FBI, I'm going to join the FBI SWAT team because that's cool. Then I'm going to join the serial killer child abduction unit, because as I was looking at the different units in the FBI, I thought, that is the most evil thing I can imagine, is what I'm learning about that serial killers do. And at the same time that I was studying that, I was learning that unit, the behavioral science unit, it was getting flooded with people, just an enormous amount, so many people that they obviously couldn't hire them all. And I had also become vegetarian and vegan at that same time I was making this plan. And so I was learning about animal rights issues. And what I learned is that out of the worst things that I've ever read about serial killers doing, similar or identical things happen to animals, but on a mass scale, and that there's a handful of civilian UC investigators in the country doing anything about it. So I decided that's where I'm more needed, and I'll combine those two passions.
Hi, I just want to say thank you also for your work and for coming to speak to us. So from my experiences, I've seen more and more people shifting their diets because they know that farming has such a negative impact on the environment and contributes so heavily to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. And so I'm wondering if you see any sort of opportunity for cities and states to impose any sort of new regulations on farming or animal welfare through their work to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and kind of is there any way to tie those two?
Sorry, wrong guy.
California has thought about doing something, and I know a lot of universities, in fact, the business school here at Harvard is engaging in a pilot program run by a group called Farm Forward. It's called the Leadership Circle, where they're developing sort of sustainability standards, and as part of the sustainability standards, they include an assessment of the impact of meat and where they source their meat and just the overall meat consumption. So it certainly is, and there's a huge Eat Answer report that just came out that a big focus of that was recommending reducing meat consumption primarily for environmental reasons. Any other questions? No?
I did not know. Thank you, Chris.
Following up on what was just spoken, in terms of what we can do either as law students or private individuals, you mentioned, for example, Massachusetts requires all consent for audio recording. Would you recommend that we ask that that be changed?
Just for me, I mean, that's hard to say. Massachusetts also has some of the best laws protecting animals in the union, so not necessarily. It's not like I see a plethora of targets I have to work here to get audio on, so.
Okay, so and I had not thought about the antibiotic. Well, I'd heard farmers say that, to hell with antibiotic free, I'm going to treat my animals. On a label, though, it's kind of hard to say no antibiotics except when an animal needs treatment. Yeah, that's kind of long for a label. And the last thing I wanted to ask is about you all investigators. Mercy for Animals was fundraising for therapy for the undercover agents, and I do not think that that's amusing. I should imagine that it's very, very difficult for you all. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, it's difficult. So I don't know exactly. It's a great question. Sorry, I don't know exactly what to say about it, but it is difficult doing UC work, and I think the main thing is that it helps if you have a certain type of personality for it. So no one is immune to the effects of it, but I feel very strongly that it helps if when you go into it, you enjoy risk taking, and you have a love for investigations over animal protection. I am for me personally, I am 49% driven by an urge to help animals. I am 51% driven by a love of investigations. So I think